Good evening. I'm Todd Fansler, and on behalf of Bethel Lutheran Church, welcome to this first Caring for Creation webinar of 2022 with our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Adrian Treves. We hope that you'll take an active part in our webinar tonight by submitting questions and comments during the presentation. Just type your question or comment using the chat feature of Zoom. On my laptop screen, there's a chat button at the bottom center of the screen. On an iPad, the chat button is probably in the upper right corner. When you click the chat button, please select the option to send your comment or question to all panelists and attendees. And don't forget to click the Enter key to actually send it. Now, here's David Knuty, one of the founders of Bethel's Caring for Creation group, to introduce our guest speaker.
Our speaker tonight is Dr. Adrian Treves, UW-Madison Professor of Environmental Studies and Director of the Carnivore Coexistence Lab of the Nelson Institute. He earned a PhD at Harvard and has done 27 years of research in ecology, law, and the human dimensions of ecosystems. This makes him especially qualified to take on the pressing public issues of the coexistence of welfare of wildlife and humanity. In this era, the intersection has become especially controversial and even urgent. Public proposals are pending to kill a large portion of the wolf population, only recently removed from threatened extinction. And the state deer population is 1.6 million and has grown 60% in 15 years. It is invading our suburbs and colliding with our cars, but it is also in a large proportion sick with an endemic disease. 2 decades, Dr. Treves's conclusions on how to distinguish the best wildlife science supported by hard data and unbiased from hidden value judgments. Treves is an active participant in the debate over wolf and hunting policy in Wisconsin, favoring more non-lethal measures of control, which he feels are scientifically and morally justified. He insists on transparency of methodology and philosophical position in wildlife research. He states that his analysis is from the perspective of the public trust principle, which considers the immediate concerns of stakeholders, but also the interests of society as a whole and future generations. I'm sure this is going to be both informative and thought-provoking. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for the very kind introduction, and to all the organizers, Todd, Ashley, and Rob, for inviting me tonight. I've been studying the wolves of Wisconsin and wolf policy for 22 years, and before that, predator-prey behavioral ecology for 10 years. And so what I'm going to do today, after I share my screen, is share some of my thoughts on the research, my view of the consensus of scientific evidence, and if time allows, end with a few of my own value judgments about where we might go in the future. So let's see how the technology works for us tonight. So can you see my title slide?
I do see it, Adrian.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right. So David asked me to talk about quite a few subjects, which led me to create this rather boring outline slide. And I do have a couple of slides that are full of text.
I'm afraid we don't see your outline slide yet, Adrian.
Oh, Todd, it looks like I'm paused again. I don't know how I stopped that last time. Was that something you did, or?
Not that I know of. However, let me see if I can I'm just going to stop your video for a second. And then ask you to start your video. Okay. And we'll try again, and we'll appeal to Ashley and Rob if they have any. There you are, full screen. There's your outline.
Yay,
Okay.
It worked. Thank you so much. So I'm going to start with just a discussion of the idea of coexisting with non-human animals, and then focus a little bit to orient us the backdrop of current public policy debates over wolves in the USA, ending with the discussion of Wisconsin's public policy debate, and then transition to a summary of the science relating to wolves' ecological interactions. So when I talk about coexistence with non-humans, I'm fully aware, and I'd like all of us to be aware of what diverse country we live in. In this context, I'm talking about the diversity of values that are out there. That means the diversity of things people feel are good or bad or they're neutral about. Very, very different values across the country, across demographic groups, across age groups. For example, does coexistence with non-humans mean conflict management, as has been traditional in the USA? Or does it mean some sort of peaceful sharing of the landscape without killing? Does it include domestic animals or just wildlife? Do we have dominion over those animals? And is there room in our public policy debate for values for wildlife that are non-European, non-anthropocentric, mutualist values, non-traditional and traditional? So I'm not going to answer these questions. I'm just raising them so we're aware of the diversity of values towards non-humans that are out there. And with that, I'll transition so that you understand that some of the current public policy debates, in fact, the majority of them, perhaps all of them, are about clashing value judgments. So if you start at the upper left of this slide, I borrowed a map of the distribution of gray wolves, that's the species Canis lupus, across the world, shown in the brownish color. So you'll see that gray wolves are actually widely distributed. So they're not globally threatened or endangered, according to the IUCN Red List, but they have been recently listed on the US Endangered Species Act because they were almost wiped out in the previous century. So when we look at the US map of gray wolf range, we get the Canis lupus species found in a number of states, Alaska, Washington, Oregon, etc. Some of that distribution is shown in the dark green there, although the map hasn't been updated to include a pack in Colorado, in the northwest corner of Colorado. But we also have two other populations of red wolves that are treated differently legally. In the far east, in North Carolina, we have red wolf, a different species, Canis rufus, that's critically endangered by the IUCN and found only in the wild in North Carolina, and it's listed under the US Endangered Species Act, or ESA. In fact, at the moment, it seems to have only 8 adults in the wild. And down in the southwest of the US, we also sometimes talk about the Mexican gray wolf, a subspecies, Canis lupus baileyii, found in Arizona and New Mexico, and listed under the US Endangered Species Act as endangered. That species is also found in Mexico as well as the US. So there are policy debates about every one of these populations in the USA. I've placed an X where there's an ongoing court case or a petition appealing to the Secretary of Interior to protect wolves. So you see the large number of X's indicating the public policy debate and the legal controversies over these populations. This reflects those conflicting value judgments about what coexistence with non-humans, or in this case, coexistence with wolves, actually means to different people. And often the plaintiffs, in every one of these cases, the plaintiffs are urging the government to tighten protections for the particular wolf population that's being discussed. And Wisconsin's no exception, as you all well have seen, I'm sure, over the last year in the news, We had 3 separate court cases filed. One has been settled, the first one by Hunter Nation. The second one is in a temporary restraining order in which the Dane County judge placed a temporary restraining order to halt the wolf hunt that would have started the 6th of November 2021 and would have still been running as I speak, except for that temporary injunction. That was a court case brought by Great Lakes Wildlife Alliance. And because of its name, the temporary injunction, the arguments in court are yet to be heard. That starts in March. Finally, number 3 on this slide is a reference to a federal court case brought by the Red Cliff government, the Ojibwe tribal government of Red Cliff, and allied governments suing the state of Wisconsin in federal court for violation of treaty rights. So Wisconsin is not only not an exception to the legal controversies, in fact, Wisconsin has become a poster child for some of the controversies over wolves, with these 3 court cases featuring prominently in media reports, as well as in scientific and social scientific and scholarly work in law, public policy, sociology, etc. All right, so I'd like to talk briefly, and I can only do it briefly because of the number of topics you've asked me to talk about tonight, and I'm happy to talk about. So I'll do a cursory summary job of describing some of the science behind the ecological interactions. While I do that, I'm going to make editorial remarks about the state of the science. And I want to emphasize here that I'm trying to interpose as few of my own personal or organizational value judgments into this assessment, but I'm human and humans always have a perspective. So I can't help having some perspective on this, but I'm going to try to signpost it for you to be as transparent as possible so you can see where my value judgments interpose themselves. For example, sorry, go back a slide. No, item number 1 is that human safety concerns are exceedingly rare and they're sometimes falsified. Recently, 2 cases in Michigan of elected and appointed officials retracting or apologizing for misleading statements they made about wolf attacks on people. And human safety concerns are exceedingly rare. I'm going to briefly show you the data. I don't expect you to read it, but I want to flag here a value judgment I'm making, because although I'm aware that wolf attacks on people, whether injurious or fatal, are frightening, tragic, and require some sort of action, thought, planning, while all of that is true, regionally, worldwide, these are exceedingly rare events and therefore should not be exaggerated or falsified, as in those 2 examples from Michigan. So the evidence I'm citing is on this slide. This will be available to you, I understand it, on the YouTube channel that the Lutheran Church has, so you can look at it at your leisure, but I'm at least showing you the evidence for the rarity of attacks on people worldwide in the last 18 years, and in particular in North America, only 2 such attacks were recorded during the 18-year period, 2002 to 2020. And therefore, this level of human safety threat is very difficult to calculate. The risk is lower than anything else that actuarial tables are kept on. And it's therefore difficult to justify interventions such as widespread wolf killing to increase human safety. Now, if we turn to the prevention of attacks on domestic animals, the frequencies are somewhat higher. Research is very clear. This is coming out of my lab, and my lab website will be made available to you. And there's a reference at the bottom of this slide if you wish to dig into the details. But the research is clear and the consensus is clear that attacks on livestock by wolves are more than 91% predictable in space, meaning where they'll happen. And that higher risk sites occupy less than 5% of wolf range, affect fewer than 1% of livestock and fewer than 1% of farms across Wisconsin, all of these statistics. Attacks on hounds also seem predictable in space, perhaps less so, but more than 75%. And If we think about other sorts of threats to animals that people care about, then we might hear people complaining about wolf attacks on deer. And to put this in perspective, when there were 1,000 wolves in the state, they ate approximately 0.06% of the state deer population annually. By comparison, cars killed 0.12%, twice as many, at least. And humans and farmers killed approximately 25% of the deer population. Furthermore, the consensus is clear, the evidence is clear that deer cause far more damage to forests, to understory plants, and to people's property, estimated in the millions of dollars annually, far more property damage from deer than from wolves. So when we consider some of the ecological interactions of wolves with their environment, with deer, with domestic animals, with people, we should probably be keeping all of these factors in perspective at once. And then it becomes a value judgment of which one might want to intervene against, which ones are serious enough to deserve further study, and so forth. So there is one aspect of wolves' interactions with humans and with domestic animals and wild ungulates like deer and elk that has been extensively studied. So we have very clear scientific consensus on the effect of killing wolves. And what I've done in this table is I've arrayed on the left column 4 common justifications governments use for killing wolves. The first one is it protects humans. The second one is it protects wild game, such as the deer and the elk. Third, very common one, possibly the most common, is that killing wolves protects domestic animals. The fourth is equally common, but perhaps flies under the radar for many people in the public, the idea that killing wolves actually raises tolerance for the surviving wolves. Now, these 4 propositions in the left column have all been studied extensively for decades by scientists. And what we're finding with these 4 is in the center column. And what we're looking for is evidence that killing wolves is effective in reducing those threats. So there's currently no evidence that killing wolves protects human safety. That's not to say that a wolf found to be posing an imminent threat to human safety should not be killed. No, that's commonly done. The evidence that we are seeking, though, as scientists, is that such killing will reduce future threats to people. And so far, there's no evidence for that because it's a vanishingly rare event, and those wolf kills have not been studied in a scientific manner. So moving to the second row, what's the evidence that killing wolves protects wild game? Here, there's an incredible amount of evidence, and it goes in every which way. And now the scientific consensus is that deer populations and elk populations are mainly controlled, mainly affected by climate, by habitat quality, and by disease, and to a lesser, much, much lesser extent, by wild predators, such that the effect of killing wolves is highly variable on deer and elk populations. So variable that often it has no effect. Sometimes it improves the conditions, the abundance, the density of the wild game. And sometimes it actually leads to reductions in the abundance of elk and deer. So to some extent, the jury's out, but predators don't seem to be a large force in shaping deer and elk populations. Now, the third row about domestic animals, here we have the best evidence. I'll return to the point about what makes it the best evidence. But we have the majority of studies finding no effect of killing wolves on the safety of livestock. In fact, there's as many cases of increased losses of livestock after killing wolves as there are of decreases. But the majority of cases find no effect of killing wolves on livestock safety. And finally, we have very strong evidence, slightly less strong than with livestock, but in our fourth row, strong evidence that killing wolves actually leads to intolerance for wolves, decreased, more negative attitudes towards wolves, and more poaching of wolves. And that research has been pioneered by my lab, studying people in Wisconsin, both in and outside of wolf range since 2001, initially led by my wife, Dr. Lisa Naughton. And then we resampled the same individuals, same Wisconsin residents over time, 4 more times as policies changed. And that research showed that people's tolerance for wolves declined steadily over time as policies liberalized wolf killing. And in fact, the target demographic, which the government hopes would increase tolerance for wolves, that is, people hunting in wolf range, that target demographic showed the greatest decline in tolerance and the highest inclination to kill wolves illegally. So when we look at the major claims about the costs of wolves and justifications for killing wolves, we find a very mixed picture with little support for the most common traditional method, which is lethal management of wolves perceived to be problems. There's a newer set of studies, and these are often one-off studies. I'll indicate where. So we need replication of the research. I would say there's not much scientific consensus yet because these studies are so new, but they're suggesting a raft of ecological benefits of healthy wolf packs. For example, a number of studies, both modeling and field studies from Europe, suggest that healthy wolf packs can reduce wildlife diseases and the zoonotic diseases that can be transmitted from wildlife to people or the other direction from people to wildlife. This is, again, somewhat preliminary and tentative and needs replication and further study. We have a raft of evidence that healthy wolf packs and populations improve the diversity of scavengers. That comes from Yellowstone National Park and Douglas Smith's research, and that's pretty much incontrovertible. Next, we have a study done here in Wisconsin by Jennifer Rayner and her colleagues that suggests that counties that contain at least one wolf, but probably more, counties with at least one wolf have fewer deer vehicle collisions, which saves human lives and millions of dollars in property across the state annually, compared to counties that do not contain wolves. Intriguing research, it replicates a finding for the Northeast US with mountain lions, but again, preliminary, it needs to be replicated and done with the highest standards of evidence. We have strong evidence from a number of types of vegetation that wolf packs are also supporting plant diversity, whether it's understory plants in Dr. Callan's research, like on the trillium shown in the photo upper left, or research by Don Waller and his colleague in forests comparing Menominee County with its intact wolf packs, the forest in Menominee County with its intact wolf packs, to neighboring counties' forests, where Dr. Waller and his colleagues have shown that forest biodiversity is higher, forest structure is more productive and mature, the forest is more resilient to non-native species in those areas where wolf packs are also present. And that many of these effects probably act through wolf predation on deer, namely, where wolves kill deer, the surviving deer are more frightened. They spend less time feeding in a particular patch of vegetation, so they do less damage by their browsing. That allows the understory plants to recover and flourish. It allows the forest structure, dynamics, and resilience to improve. The deer, if they're more scared, are somewhat less likely to be struck by vehicles, apparently. And perhaps the transmission of zoonotic and wildlife diseases from deer would change in pattern. Again, this science is the newest and needs some confirmation. All right, so I've been talking about value judgments in science, and I want to spend 2 slides explaining what these terms mean, helping you to discern value judgments from science so that you can unpack agency statements and interest group claims, including claims of scientists like myself. So to start off, I use an analogy or a metaphor of apples and oranges, where apples, let's say, are value judgments and oranges are evidence or facts. Now, you can certainly mix apples and oranges into a nice fruit salad or some kind of juice cocktail, but it's impossible to turn an apple into an orange and vice versa. So the metaphor is useful for thinking about how value judgments and facts interact with each other, but they can't change from one to the other, right? Value judgments are, again, things that we like or dislike or are neutral to, things we find are good or bad or we're neutral to. And they may change through persuasion or personal experience or some sort of interaction with opposing values. Claims about facts can inform the value judgments. Perhaps I'm persuaded by some fact or some fact claim, but they don't invalidate my value judgments. And we all know examples in our own lives, perhaps of loved ones or even ourselves, in which despite the facts, we hold value judgments dear. So those two cannot invalidate each other. Likewise, facts are observations or measurements of the universe, and they are evaluated in completely different ways than value judgments. It's irrelevant if I like or dislike a fact. The question about a fact is, what are the methods used? Was it replicated? Are those methods transparent? So in the same way, value judgments cannot invalidate facts. They're just different fruit, apples and oranges. And I've put the photos of aspects of our government here to indicate that different branches of the US government use facts and values in different ways. So bottom right, the US Supreme Court supposedly is highly evidence-based, and value judgments play some part, of course, in the statement of the law, but justices are supposed to evaluate evidence as well as value judgments. Whereas at the ballot box, upper left, and other branches of our government, such as the legislative and the executive branch, much more attention is paid to value judgments than to facts. And that is actually one reason why many of the common fact claims that I showed in a previous slide, fact claims made by governments about killing wolves, actually turn out not to be supported by peer-reviewed scientific evidence that's been validated over decades and is scientific consensus at this point. That really fundamentally hinges on how our government balances facts against value judgments. Let me give you some examples of how facts and value judgments play out in an issue like predator conservation or predator management or wolf killing. So you will hear statements like the following: we cannot afford alternatives to killing predators or to raising cattle or some such. Other statements you might hear are some predators cannot coexist near people, or we have to be fair to people. Statements like an individual animal pays the price to save the population, or as long as we use humane methods, killing predators is ethical, or non-lethal methods are ethical. And statements like if sustainable and profitable, we should do it. Every one of those statements I just made are value judgments. Some of them are masquerading as fact claims, but they're all judgments about what we can afford, what someone wants to do, what we all should do or ought to do, or what we need. Those are emblematic value judgments. That should trigger an alarm bell in your head. Not that it's bad, but that you're listening to someone's value judgment. And it's okay to talk about your values. That's part of the political process, and it's okay to disagree with someone's values. But to distinguish those from fact claims or statements of evidence, like I have in the second half, lower half of this slide, lethal management raises human tolerance. That's a fact claim, and the science has disproven it, as I showed earlier. Wolf killing reduces poaching. That's a fact claim, and the science doesn't support it. Killing wolves prevents losses of property. Again, a fact claim that the science doesn't support. Killing wolves controls population size and distribution. That may be correct. It's a fact claim. It needs study. It needs scientific evaluation, not a value judgment about whether it's correct or false. And killing wolves raises money for other conservation activities. That may be true. That's a scientifically testable fact claim. So what I'm trying to do here is support you all to be critical consumers, the critical public that will hold our government accountable. And that's a perfect transition to think about Wisconsin's wolf hunt of February 2021, which was a tangle of values and fact claims. Just for example, should we hunt during breeding season? That's a value judgment, whether one should or not. No matter what position you hold or if you're neutral, that's going to be decided by values. There's no scientific evidence that can support such a claim. And any kind of statement that starts with should or includes should or ought to is your flag. It's your warning that a value judgment is being trotted out. Should one trap, hound, snowmobile, nighttime hunt wolves? Again, all value judgments. These were all made by the Wisconsin government based on regulations passed in previous years. So many laws and regulations simply emanate from value judgments, not from science. Should we hold a second wolf hunt in November 2021? Again, a value judgment. Now, those were tangled up in a claim made by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources that they're using science-based decisions, and I'll show you why. So here are some of the facts that come out of the February 2021 wolf hunt. There was an overkill, overshooting the quota by 82%. That's a simple observation or measurement. However, the decision to call it overkill, or to call it overshooting the quota, or to call it taking the tribal quota, those are all value judgments about what words one uses. And then we showed in a peer-reviewed paper that's cited at the bottom of this slide that the population of wolves declined more than 27, possibly more than 33% in 1 year. That's an observation or a measurement. It's actually derived from a model, therefore it's an inference from observations and measurements. And there's no statement in there of whether that's good, bad, or neutral. However, it should inform at least the answer to, should we hold a second wolf hunt in November 2021? However, our state agency did not take it into account, although it was presented with that information, in deciding to hold a second wolf hunt in November 2021. And we had no data on the reproductive activities and reproductive success of wolf packs across the state in summer 2021, at least no official data. There were some nonprofit organizations giving us a little bit of information about that. So with no information on that and no data on poaching or illegal killing of wolves, those are all facts which should inform a value judgment. We hear very little of that sort of clear separation of facts and values in the wolf public policy in Wisconsin, in my experience. And that's a value judgment that I'm making about the policy debate surrounding wolves in our state. So I'm going to show you I'm giving you a sneak preview here of new data, should be coming out this month by myself and my PhD student, Naomi Lauchauarn. And what's happening in this somewhat busy slide, I'll take it apart for you, is on the x-axis, we have an estimate of the wolf population size in the state by April of this year, right? We're projecting the April 2022 wolf population in the state. And we've set some vertical lines in order to indicate what value judgments are out there. That's the decisions made by the government and the people of Wisconsin over the years about certain appropriate or inappropriate thresholds for the wolf population. So let's start at the far left with the vertical red line just above 0. That's the level of extirpation. That's the level at which there would be no surviving breeding wolf packs in the state of Wisconsin, the red vertical line. Now, if you move to the right and look at the orange vertical line at 250, that's the state delisting level or listing level. Below 250 wolves, and the state endangered species statute kicks in and protects wolves as a threatened or endangered species. So wolf hunting would have to stop, for example, and other regulations kick into gear. The yellow vertical line moving to the right is at 350, and that's the 1999 population goal set by the Wolf Management Plan, right? So those vertical lines represent value judgments from law or from what we define as extirpation of wolves in the case of the red line. Now, we've superimposed on those lines 3 approximately bell-shaped curves that represent estimates of the wolf population size in blue, gray, and green. And those are 3 different scenarios in the different colors. The green scenario on the far left is what would have happened to the wolf population by our estimates if the Natural Resource Board quota of 300 had been implemented for the November 2021 wolf hunt. The gray bell-shaped curve is the Department of Natural Resources recommended quota of 130. And the blue is what actually happened, a quota of 0 as ordered by the state court. So again, scientists like myself, what we do is we take value judgments when we turn them into quantitative thresholds, and then we take the data on mortality and reproduction of wolves and the past population status, and we attempt to predict what will happen if various policies occur. So again, the bell curve in green and gray and blue, those bell curves represent possible policies for wolf hunting, and the vertical lines in red, orange, and yellow tell us whether such hunting would lead to crossing a threshold that was a value judgment by society. Again, I'm trying to help you distinguish fact claims from value judgments without interposing too many of my own personal judgments. So that leads me to, how do we distinguish the best available science from the rest? And I'm going to say 2 things about this. The phrase best available science comes from the US Endangered Species Act and is often repeated in state endangered species statutes. It's a requirement that decisions about extinction and imperiled species are made in the case of the US Endangered Species Act. Those decisions about imperiled species have to be based solely on the best available scientific and commercial data. That is extremely hard to do for anybody, including myself, because it's so easy to interpose our personal value judgments. But that's what the law says. And so we tend to hold the government to that standard. That's the first thing I'm going to say. Second thing I'm going to say about best science is that many other fields of science are way ahead of wildlife science. In particular, biomedicine is way ahead in terms of quality of evidence. And social psychology and other branches of psychology are catching up quickly. Those 2 fields, biomedicine and psychology, have been grappling with a crisis called the reproducibility crisis. And in a nutshell, the reproducibility crisis is a crisis that prominent scientific results that get a lot of attention cannot be repeated or replicated. And to replicate a study, a particular finding that's published, one would like independent scientists to be able to repeat it using the same methods and get similar or the same results. So biomedicine and psychology are grappling with this reproducibility crisis that many prominent scientific findings are simply not replicated. They're not being repeated. They cannot be reproduced and are therefore considered unreliable or invalid. This is probably almost certainly, okay, I'm going to say it, In my opinion, it is certain that wildlife science is undergoing a reproducibility crisis also, but we're not as aware of it because there's a struggle, a clash of values within the wildlife science community. All right, enough of that rhetoric about best science. Some of the principles I've listed here: transparency, independent review, and reproducibility. Let me explain. These are principles of open science, and they tend to improve reproducibility. So transparency simply refers to clear, open statements of assumptions, methods, analyses, and interpretations, and sharing of data openly so that other scientists, independent scientists, can attempt to repeat the findings. Independent review is absolutely crucial, and it simply consists of that open process of sharing methods and data so that others can evaluate what was done, decide if it was done properly, and try to repeat it themselves. And reproducibility is the umbrella term for both the practices of individual scientists, but also the practices of the field of editors and scientific journals to make sure the scientific findings are reliable and valid. So one problem we have currently in the wildlife management field is that agencies around the country, and I include the Wisconsin DNR, are not transparent about sharing their data. They don't subject their data or methods to independent review, and they're not worried about the reproducibility of their results or whether their results are valid and reliable and can be replicated by independent scientists. All right, this is some pretty heavy stuff. So to lighten the mood a little bit, I've put in this humorous photo of demonstrators for better science asking, what do we want? Evidence-based change, or you could put in evidence-based policy. And when do we want it? After peer review. That's a joke because peer review and the production of good reproducible science, both those processes take so long that it's very hard for policymakers to wait. They're called on in emergencies. They're called on by interest groups wanting urgent change, urgent action. Policymakers look for the best possible information, we would hope, and they do what they can with uncertainty. So the reality is that public policy making and science work on different time scales and sometimes have different procedures for protecting value judgments. Political or public policy processes embrace value judgments. Scientists need to keep them at arm's length and be transparent about those value judgments. So it can be fraught, especially in environmental policy, when policy is supposed to be based only on the best available science. But we know people making the decisions are humans. They have their value judgments. They may be influenced by persuasive speaking rather than by the best evidence. I'm going to skip through this quickly, but just to say that we're working on describing best science. And for now, we have a rating system that goes from platinum to gold to silver to bronze to lower on the y-axis here. And for those of you familiar with standards of evidence in research, RCT on the left stands for the randomized controlled trial. If you can make, that's often called the gold standard in research. In biomedicine, they call it that. One can even improve on the gold standard, but I'm calling your attention to it because I want to go back to one of my slides to show you standards of evidence about wolf killing. So what I've done here is I've repeated the same table, except rather than telling you the results, I'm telling you about the methods and the standards of evidence, and I've sorted them from best evidence to weakest. So at the top, the evidence about wolf killing protecting domestic animals, that's the results are drawn from gold or silver standard, randomized controlled trials, or before and after comparisons of interventions without randomization. That's what BACI stands for, BACI, before and after comparison of interventions without randomization is the silver standard. We have very few studies of protecting domestic animals from wolves that are gold standard, that are the randomized controlled trials. In fact, we have none on lethal management. that fit the gold standard. But we do now have 4 studies of non-lethal methods for protecting livestock from wolves that have been tested and proven effective using the gold standard of randomized controlled trials. So if you just scan down the table, you'll see that the strength of evidence diminishes for each one of the rows below it. So that we actually have rather poor evidence for the effectiveness of wolf killing, and yet we have scientific consensus. So there's room for improvement. All right, so the last 2 points of my slide are to talk about fair governance of wildlife management and what you and I can do to support more fair governments and a more just and healthy relationship to nature. So spoiler alert here, I'm stepping away from the science entirely. There's still some scholarship in here, but really here come my value judgments. And to start with, fair governance. We need to hold our wildlife managers to public trust principles. In a sentence, the public trust doctrine, it's a legal doctrine. That means guidance to courts and attorneys and governments. The public trust doctrine says that government's duty is to preserve wildlife as a trust for future generations. And to preserve it, they have to prioritize protection. And the current users, the current adults who would like to use wildlife, come second. And in particular, our government needs to account for the wildlife trust in a sophisticated way with the best available science, and do it transparently and be accountable to all of the public as the beneficiaries. So in that context of the public trust, the role of the Department of Natural Resources and Natural Resource Board here in Wisconsin should be scrutinized, and I would argue should be reformed towards a trusteeship relationship where those appointed and elected officials are trustees for all of us, for the broad public, and for current and future generations, regardless of whether they use wildlife, hunt wildlife, see wildlife, or feed wildlife. It's a trust for all of us and in perpetuity. And right now, some of the shenanigans occurring between the DNR and the NRB really put to shame this idea, this legal concept of trusteeship. Those are the executive branch agencies, and their role should be distinct from the role of the legislature, which under our constitutional system is about making the rules, but not executing or enforcing them. And currently, the legislative approval of the chair or of new appointees to the Natural Resource Board might be infringing on the power of the executive branch in our constitutional democracy. And finally, the role of the judiciary. Judges have an important constitutional role to resolve cases and controversies, and their protection of the public trust in this case allows them to overrule majority rule. So it doesn't matter if the majority of our legislature wishes to hunt wolves. They can't hunt wolves to extinction according to the public trust doctrine, and the judiciary has the power to enforce that. These are principles of law that the US Supreme Court has upheld since 1842, and most notably in the case of Illinois Central Railroad in 1892, which is still good law today. So the public trust is real. It simply isn't being enforced, and often our agencies are paying lip service to it. So what can you and I do? Well, we have to vote. We have to vote for nature and future generations, more than our wallets, I would argue. And we have to hold our appointed and elected officials accountable for best available science, for public trusteeship, and for your values and those of future generations. So again, disclaimer, those are my value judgments. I don't expect you to view them as any more important than your own value judgments. It's not like scientific evidence, as I presented earlier in this talk, which should be reproducible and valid and reliable, but cannot be overturned by your value judgments or mine if we don't like them. So thank you again for the kind invitation. I hope this was thought-provoking, and I welcome any questions you might have. I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully you can all hear me. This is Todd Fansler from Bethel Lutheran again, and I'm going to attempt to help with the discussion period. I don't know if Adrian has had a chance to look at the quite a number of questions that we've had come in. I'll try in some cases to condense or to pull out the common elements where we have some overlap between questions. And I'll start with one of the later questions because I think it affects all of your discussion, and that is, can you explain exactly how the DNR and researchers like yourself estimate the wolf population?
Okay, that's a complicated question. So let me start with a historical note that starting in 1995, okay, before 1995, DNR biologists, helped by a handful of the public volunteers, counted every occurrence of breeding wolf packs by their estimate by doing snow track surveys. In 1995 and every year since then, volunteers from the public who received track training and passed certain minimum criteria for reliability, they contributed to that count as the wolf population spread across the state. This was snow season, winter snow track counts conducted by approximately 100 volunteers every year in collaboration with DNR biologists. On top of that, the state supplemented those winter counts with aerial radio telemetry, where wolves affixed with VHS collars were followed, usually from the air, from fixed wing aircraft, every few weeks, sometimes once a month, so that the pilots could see the wolf that they were tracking by radio signals. They could actually see them. I've been up in those planes with those pilots. They're incredible. And they could count the number of wolves with those fellows, because on average, about 13% of the wolf population had radio collars. That's since dropped to about 5%. And after 2012, the methods of counting changed several times. So that's how the raw data are collected from the field observations and measurements. And then there's some analysis of the data using a variety of methods. Now, 5 years ago, the DNR added a new method called the occupancy model. You may have read about in the news. It became important in the last year because of the February 2021 wolf hunt. And so for approximately 5 years, the state was conducting two separate methods of counting. The old method with biologists and volunteers on the ground and pilots flying for the radio collared wolves, and then the new method called occupancy modeling that involves remote trail cameras and involves an estimation technique and extrapolation. Wherever they found wolves on camera, they would do some analyses that haven't been peer reviewed and published yet, to my knowledge. They would do some analyses and estimate how many wolves were living in that particular place and extrapolate across the state. That second, newer occupancy model tends to overestimate it produces a higher estimate of the number of wolves than the traditional method using snow track surveys and aircraft and summer howling surveys too. So we had these two different methods. They're now switching completely over to the new method because it's less expensive, but it has very wide bounds of uncertainty on it. For example, the estimate for the wolf population in April 2020, before the wolf hunt, was an average of 1,195 wolves across the state, but the error bounds on that were several hundred wolves in either direction. So it could have been as few as 950 wolves, approximately here, up to over 1,400 wolves in the state. And those wide bounds of uncertainty create a lot of uncertainty for decision makers who have to settle on a single number for whatever purpose, whether it's wolf hunting or a particular locality that they have to manage intensively, for example. So I hope that helps to answer your question. And I've been using the DNR's older method for all of our population estimates and forecasts.
Okay, thank you. I noticed in the chat that there were some a few questions that coalesced on the matter of where wolves tend to be found versus human population, vehicles, et cetera. Namely, the wolves tend to be predominantly in the northern, less populated regions of the state, so that it seems less likely that wolf predation on deer, for example, would be effective in reducing collisions of vehicles with deer, and that in the wolves are less likely to thrive in the southern half of the state, where deer overpopulation and chronic wasting disease are a significant issue. And again, that would argue perhaps that the wolves would be not such an effective regulatory mechanism on those effects. Would you care to comment, respond to that?
Yeah, I think in general, the predictions are probably likely to be correct. Let me describe how Jennifer Rayner and her colleagues did their analyses. They did what's called a before and after comparison of the same counties before wolves were present compared to after, and they corrected for demographic changes in the county, which would affect traffic flow. They also used Department of Transportation data to try to correct for changes in each county that were unrelated to wolves. And they used the changes in the deer population as well. And their analyses are an aggregation of different counties, but with each analysis or each data point is a within county comparison. So they're not comparing, say, Marathon County to Dane County. And that increases one's confidence somewhat in the results, but we still need a gold standard randomized controlled trial to be sure that they've identified the causal mechanism correctly. Now, having said that, their results are quite strong and therefore were published in a top journal, Proceedings of the National Academies of Science. That's impressive. The review standard is very high there. The study absolutely needs to be replicated. I'm not saying that because it got into a great journal, it must be true. A lot of lousy science and science even that's been retracted is published in great journals. But at least the initial standards of open science have been met, and now we need to reproduce the results. Finally, in practical terms, I think you're correct that the very high rate of deer vehicle collisions seen in Dane County, the very high rate of chronic wasting disease, is unlikely to be influenced by wolves that are outside of our county. So I think the questioner's hunch is absolutely correct that we need more native predators to do this sort of ecological benefit for us, this ecosystem service, if you will.
Scrolling through the many questions to try to make sure that we cover a range. How would restoring the Endangered Species Act transform the wolf management issue in Wisconsin? Would it end the wolf hunt or simply put it under tighter standards?
Okay, I'm sympathetic to this question because it's even difficult for someone like me steeped in this to follow the ups and downs. So let's start by pointing out that the Trump administration removed gray wolves from the list of endangered species, except those in Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, and parts of Oregon and Washington. So with that huge exception, it's the remainder of the gray wolf population that I showed in my map earlier that was affected by the Trump delisting action. Now, those other wolves in Montana, Wyoming, et cetera, were already delisted by a congressional budget rider. So we have to keep those separate, because if the ongoing federal court case right now outside of Wisconsin, it's a national federal court case, if the plaintiffs prevail there in their demand for relisting wolves, it would affect wolves in California, Colorado, Western Oregon, Washington, and Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. All of those wolves would be returned to federal protection under the Endangered Species Act, and all of the state killing programs that exist in those states, all but California and Colorado, all those state killing programs would have to stop immediately. However, the Wisconsin state statute, Act 169, that designates wolves as game, would remain on the books. It's unaffected by the federal status. The statute remains on the books. It's simply that the state cannot issue hunting permits for wolves when the feds hold authority. All right, now then we have a state court case ongoing. One of the claims in that state court case is that the Act 169 is unconstitutional. If that argument prevails, the act is removed from the book of statutes in Wisconsin, and then wolf hunts would be illegal even if the federal government wasn't in control. I hope that answers the question. I realize it's a super confusing constellation of plaintiffs and defendants and different governments and different states. But we're talking currently about wolves in our state are legal game. They're not protected federally, but they're currently not being hunted because of a Dane County Circuit Court temporary restraining order.
A question that I claim for my own. A recent PBS NewsHour story reported on detection of COVID in white-tailed deer in Pennsylvania. Is there any concern about a reverse zoonotic transmission from deer to human, especially if the deer population becomes a factory for COVID mutations?
Okay, yes, I read the summary of that study. And in fact, I point out that they detected COVID even further west than Pennsylvania in deer. So I'm not an expert on this. I think Dr. Tony Goldberg from UW-Madison is an expert on this topic. There are two questions we have to ask. One is, how did deer get human, SARS-CoV-2? And that begs a question about farmed deer, captive deer facilities. The second question we should be asking is whether deer can transmit it back to humans. I would say we should take the precautionary approach and assume they can, but until that's verified, we probably shouldn't get alarmed. And then possibly a third question we should ask is, if COVID becomes endemic in deer and circulates through their populations, is there a risk of a new mutant that can reinfect us or continue to infect us? I'm not an expert on the topic. It's not in my wheelhouse, but thank you for continuing to read and asking these tough questions.
One of the questions we've received goes back to the matter of estimating the deer population, and says that where the DNR says the pack is 3 to 5, I presume 3 to 5 wolves, trail cameras show 3 times that number running freely. And how can that be reconciled, or how does the DNR reconcile those large differences?
Okay, so I have 2 answers for that. And if the listener would like to email me for the evidence supporting what I'm about to say, I welcome that email. The first one is that in the summertime, when pups are born and they are late summer, when they start traveling with the adults, you can have a litter of 6, possibly even more pups traveling with a pack of wolves, and the maximum number of adults, or the maximum pack size in Wisconsin ever recorded was 12. So conceivably, you could have 12 adults with perhaps 6 large pups traveling with them. However, that's a very brief period of the year. Mortality is extremely high in wolves. It's been underestimated by the DNR systematically. We've proven it. The mortality is so high that most pups die. And by winter time, we're down to an average pack size of about 4, with maybe 75% of pups of the year having died already. The second thing I want to say is that it is nearly impossible to count pack size from trail cameras. I know this from thousands of hours with students and my own camera trapping activities. You rarely get a whole group in one frame of a trail camera, in fact, almost never. And there's nothing to say that they haven't just moved around the back of the camera, sniffing and being seen and photographed again and again. And therefore, to infer that there's more wolves than you saw in a single frame is an inaccurate and unreliable inference. And I'm happy to share the evidence that proves these points.
Okay, so the questioner can contact you by email. And I'll take just one last question, I think, before we close tonight, since we've run a bit over time, but there's been a lot of interest. I'm not sure if this is intended perhaps a bit whimsically, or perhaps it's entirely serious. How about introducing a pack to control deer in the UW Arboretum, and to give those who wish to see wolves have them close to home instead of the north third of the state, where the public has a more negative perception of the wolf?
Yeah, I sort of welcome that suggestion, with done with care. Many people don't know that, for example, there's a higher density of coyotes in urban and suburban Chicago than in the rural areas of Illinois. And the residents of those areas have almost zero conflicts with coyotes. We've in fact detected ecosystem and ecological benefits for instance, controlling species that are causing a lot of damage, and some non-native species. The coyotes are controlling those. So I welcome this kind of suggestion for wildlife managers. However, it comes with a responsibility by the agency and by the advocates proposing that kind of reintroduction. It comes with a responsibility to use science at every step. And that means not having a hair trigger response to conflicts, because they probably will occur. People will see wolves. People will be frightened, not necessarily because they're at risk, but that's because people respond in certain ways to wild animals, especially those that make eye contact, like, feral dogs, domestic dogs, and wolves. They make eye contact with us, and that can be scary to people. So, it's not entirely whimsical. I think the listener who asks it may be trying to be provocative, because there's this rural-urban divide in our country that's basically a clash of values. And I think if we're going to do anything to bring the sides closer together, I think, folks like myself should be willing to consider such provocative or whimsical suggestions. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to call a halt at the end of our time. We've stayed a bit over. Thanks to everyone who's joined us for this event, especially everyone who submitted questions and comments. We've certainly had some lively discussion, and we hope that you found this time interesting and informative. Please join us again in 4 weeks as we welcome Bethel's own Dr. Gisela Kutzbach to bring us the 20-year history of Madison's beautiful Lakeshore Nature Preserve, an inspiring story of conservation and commitment. Special thanks tonight to Ashley Becker and Rob Colehep for their behind-the-scenes technical support, to David Canuti for arranging our event, and especially to our speaker, Adrian Treves.
Thank you.
If someone you know would have liked to view today's event but couldn't, it's been recorded and will soon be on the Caring for Creation page on Bethel's website. So good night, and may good health and the peace of God be with us all.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.